Hello, this is Troy Schlicker with the Austin Spotlight. I am joined today by Jeanette Hargreaves. How's it going, Jeanette?
I'm good. How you doing, Troy?
I am doing well. Jeanette is a author, speaker, and coach of Temper Coaching, and she does family stuff, some life stuff, and a bunch of different things. I'm sure we'll have some time to get into, but just wanted to first say thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. So I always kind of start off with everyone doing what I call like kind of their origin story, partially because it's kind of, for a lot of people, it's how they get into what they do, but also, especially here in Austin, so many people aren't from Austin originally. And so everyone kind of has an origin story of kind of what brought them to Austin as well. So what would that be for you?
Absolutely. Well, let's see. You asked a couple of questions. One, where did I come from?
Yeah.
Well, I was born in Dallas, and I grew up in Albuquerque, though, with my parents. My dad was a teacher. My mom was a nurse. And when I got married, I ended up moving to Austin with my husband. We got in the year 2000, right before the tech bubble burst.
Yeah.
And we got really lucky. He got an amazing job, and we ended up in an amazing town. And I ended up going to seminary school here for my master's in divinity. There's a really neat little area of town just north of UT where there's a couple of seminaries. And I went to the one called the Seminary of the Southwest. And I could have been a priest, Troy.
Okay.
In the Episcopal Church. Women can be priests there, and married women can be priests. But I decided that I wanted to help families instead. And let me tell you why. It's because I grew up with a dad who yelled and who slapped me, who spanked us as kids. And when my kids were born, I have twins who are 10 years old now. I thought that's the way you were supposed to discipline children. And so I was a yeller and a spanker too. And I thought that's how you were supposed to teach children respect. But it just didn't feel good. It didn't feel right to me. So I got help, and now I help others. And that's what I'm doing with my degree. Instead of being a priest in a church, I'm kind of like a priest for the people.
Sure. Kind of specialized, right? Because obviously a pastor or priest that's in a church does a lot of stuff for their church, for the people in their congregation. You just get to focus on a very specific portion of that without the confines of being in a church, right? So having your own business that way, and kind of focus on something that you obviously are very passionate about and enjoy.
Yes, absolutely. And I just love having an impact. And I know that for every family I help, not only does it help them, it has ripple effects within their own extended families and potentially with their children for generations.
Well, I was just going to mention that you talked about, for you, right, that's how you grew up. So that's how you thought you were supposed to parent, because let's be honest, our education system, in lacking a lot of different things, it doesn't teach us necessarily how to be parents. And so for almost everyone, their understanding of how to be a parent is how they were raised, right, wrong, or indifferent, or otherwise. And so if you're raised where physical punishment is part of being raised, you just assume that's part of how you're supposed to be a parent as well. Whether it's yelling, spankings, all those different kind of things. And so it would just be natural for that to be the case. And so, like you say, you definitely will impact generations, because if you're helping a family from stopping physical or emotional abuse on their kids, knowingly or unknowingly, that's going to impact how their kids understand how to raise their kids in 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, however that may be.
Yeah, that's right. Something that I realized is that as a yeller and a spanker, I ended up being connected to a lot of yellers and spankers. And when I first found out that there were people in the world who raised their children differently, that was a revelation to me. I had no idea. And now I'm connected to so many people who are using social emotional learning and emotional intelligence and disciplining children in an entirely different way. I like to call it in a Christian way. I like to call it behavioral discipleship, where we really model as parents our family values and we teach our family values, including kindness. And you know that if you're yelling at your kid or threatening them, punishing them, that's not kind. So you teach by what you do, and you teach your kids by what you teach as well. And to me, that's true discipleship.
Yes, no, very, very much so that way. So you've written a book which kind of talks about your transformation from parent that was more on the physical and yelling side of things to not doing that. The title of the book, "The Day I Threw the Banana Bread and Almost Went to Jail." How did that book come about?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, with a lot of people, when they have a transformation in their lives, there's a rock bottom moment. And for me, one of my rock bottom moments was the day I threw banana bread. I threw banana bread not at my kids, but I threw it at my dad, my own father, as an adult. And I was just rageful with him. I was seeing red. And I did get in a lot of trouble for it, Troy, but I'm not going to tell your audience what kind of trouble I got into because I want people to buy the book and read the book. And right in that first chapter, I dive right into that story about what happened and how I got in trouble, and then how everything sort of began to break open for me in terms of realizing all kinds of things. For example, when you're angry, you don't have to be upset. In my family growing up, if you said, "I got angry," that meant that you yelled or you threw something or you hit something or you hit someone. But I can be perfectly angry now and look like this. I can look calm on the outside, and I can be reasonable and say, okay, that makes me feel angry. Do I want to do something about it, or do I just want to work on calming myself down? And one of the things that I am angry about is that we don't get educated. I love that you mentioned that, Troy. So that's really what I'm doing with my business and my books, is I'm educating people about better ways to raise children. The United States is kind of far behind in this. There are 62 countries worldwide already where corporal punishment of children is just illegal. So for that reason, my first book was really written for moms. My next book that's coming out is written for dads. And then the book after that is written for classroom teachers so that they can learn how to discipline children in emotionally intelligent ways and teach the parents as well through the classroom setting how to discipline kids at home.
One of the things you mentioned, as well as early on, almost all the other parents that you knew kind of disciplined their kids the same way. What was one of the ways? Was it you breaking out and realizing you wanted to raise your kids and discipline your kids differently that led you to find other parents and families and stuff that didn't do that? Or was it, did you start to, for some, through church, through Facebook, through another avenue, did you start to find people like that, and that grew your interest in trying to achieve that?
For me, it wasn't actually looking for parenting skills and parenting techniques, because I was so unaware that there were millions of books about parenting. Some people I hear, they say there are no parenting manuals. There are like a million parenting manuals now. It's just that sometimes we're in these social bubbles where we're simply unaware. And that's something I am very adamant about, is being very loving towards the whole experience, the whole human experience that we're all going through. I was simply addressing bad habits. So I was looking for how to be the best person. In seminary school, I feel like that's what they were really teaching me. I was in search of truth, meaning, how to be a good person, how to make an impact. And I ended up working with some coaches and counselors as a result. And that's really what began to open my eyes and open doors for me and help me eventually seek out and learn about different ways to discipline.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, also, like you mentioned, our experiences are generally formed by how we grew up, our experiences. And so, or our knowledge is formed by our experiences. And so, right, like the way that I love my parents, and so the way that I was raised, would be probably very similar to how I would raise kids. Maybe some tweaks here and there. Again, no one does it perfect, and no one, just because you don't spank your kids doesn't mean you do it perfect either. In that regard, that's not the goal in raising kids, but it's just something that, like you say, it's just also interesting that people think they can't find resources, because I feel like that's, especially in the last 10, 15, 20 years with the internet and stuff like that, like there's resources for almost anything in the world. And it's like somebody that says, oh, I can't find a way to diet and exercise. I mean, that's, as someone who enjoys that I'm like, there's endless amounts of that kind of information. And so it is definitely a matter of actively going out and trying to seek it and challenge yourself to maybe get outside that bubble of what you're used to and comfortable with in order to have that growth.
Yeah, and you might be surprised. There are statistics that during the pandemic itself, over 50% of American families have used corporal punishment with their kids. And I know we live in Austin, but outside of Austin, in a lot of the rural towns, there are even public schools and even high schools that are still using corporal punishment as a form of discipline in the schools. So there are, it's almost like you don't know that you can search for this. I know we have the internet at our fingertips, but for example, I had never heard of emotional intelligence before. And when I stumbled across that on the internet, I was like, what is this thing? Oh my goodness. And then I have the search term, right? So I Google emotional intelligence and oh my goodness, it's like this whole world opened up to me. And I was like, yes, this is what I didn't even know that I needed. And here it is. And that is what happens a lot of times, Troy, when people meet me and when they hear my phrase, I say, I help moms who lose their temper. A lot of them will say, oh my goodness, I didn't even know that you existed.
Sure.
And I was just praying last night that I could learn how to stop yelling. It's like you get stuck in this very torturous cycle where you yell and you feel guilty about it and you feel trapped. You don't know that there's any different way to do it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, again, as someone who doesn't have kids, so it makes it, haven't had to put any of that kind of stuff in practice. But again, kind of for me as someone who enjoys working out and being healthy and stuff that way, there's parallels in the fact that the practice of it or the concepts of it are relatively simple. The practice of it is what makes it hard, right? We all know that if we eat healthy, go to the gym, work out, that you'll be in relatively good shape. But doing that on a daily basis, if that's not what you're comfortable with and what you're used to, is very hard. And so similar in parenting, right? If you feel like or know you shouldn't be yelling at your kids or spanking them or those kind of behaviors, but that's something that you've been doing for forever and something your parents did, that makes it a lot harder to break that cycle that you're in. It's one of those that from the outside people may say, oh, well, don't do that. You just don't need to do that. But it's also easier to say that than it is to really stop doing that, or, and it's not even stop doing that, but find the alternative, because in many of those cases there is some action that should be taken, right? Like maybe it's not as severe as getting a spanking, but it's rare in a relatively healthy home that a kid has a spanking for not doing anything. There are homes where unfortunately that does happen as well too. That's kind of a whole nother thing. But right, if the kid has misbehaved or not listened or done something that does deserve some correction, then it's finding those an alternative way to get that message through. If you should, if you shouldn't be spanking or spanking too much or those kind of things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I love that you mention being healthy and working out and eating right, because that's a habit. And this way we misbehave ourselves by going to the pantry and eating too many potato chips, and even the way that our children misbehave. Troy, this is what I've learned. All of those are coping tools for stress. Misbehavior is a sign or a symptom of stress. And so if you can get to the heart of what is happening underneath those bad habits that you have, a lot of times there's sadness there. There might be anger or feelings of stress. If you can notice the habit and then look under it and say, what's going on here? How am I feeling about this? And what do I really value? So, for example, some people have been feeling really worried through the pandemic, and they end up going to the pantry and stuffing themselves with carbs. That's a coping tool because carbs actually do calm your nervous system down for a short period of time. But over the long period, it's not healthy for our bodies. But if you can get under that habit of stuffing yourself with carbs, or I want to even say yelling at your own kids, you can say, I'm worried. I'm worried about the pandemic. I'm worried about my own health. I'm worried about getting sick. Or in the case of a parent, I'm worried about my own child. And I want them to grow up to be healthy, productive adults. So once you identify the feeling, then you can figure out what your values are. If you're worried about your health, then you take steps from there. You say, oh, okay, I am going to exercise more. I'm going to toss these carbs out of my pantry and I'm going to fill my fridge with meat and vegetables, or beans and vegetables if you're a vegetarian. If you're worried about your child, which so many parents are, especially dads. My mind is a lot on dads these days because I'm working on my next book. Dads especially really want the future success of their child. And so they will yell at them when they're worried. They're like, oh my goodness, I can't have my child out as an adult doing that in the world. But yelling is not the way to teach them how to be a healthy adult. Because what happens is you end up with this cycle where you yell, and then guess what? The child yells right back at you. And then when they're an adult, what are they going to do? They're going to yell too. Right. So once you identify, oh, I'm worried about the future success of my child, how can what kind of adult do I want them to be? And how can I teach them and model how to be that kind of adult? And you can see there are parallels in this sort of universe of habits, right? Where we talk about bad habits versus good habits and cultivating the good ones, letting go of the bad ones.
So as someone who is relatively healthy, I do have to have my own PSA saying carbs are not bad. Now, mindless eating of carbs, okay, yes, not so good. But carbs themselves, because everyone likes to demonize carbs, carbs aren't
Right.
bad. Okay,
Yes.
completely off topic. You mentioned being stressed. You're talking about like parents being stressed, which is why they gravitate towards yelling and spanking. I also think, so as someone who was spanked on rare occasions because I was an angel, and so, right, so it was very rare occasions, but I do think that there can potentially be a place for that. However, if yelling and spanking is your go-to all the time, again, it's I don't quite want to say lazy, but it is kind of almost a lazy, reactionary, short-term effect, instead of really building, again, those traits. If you're trying to have a child become capable and understanding and stuff too, right, building their intelligence of, okay, I shouldn't have done this because of this, and actually really teaching and stuff, which is more challenging. It takes more time. Again, for young kids, those concepts don't get through on the first time, where a spanking kind of seems to get through, at least right away, in that regard. But it's not necessarily building that up. One of the other things that I've always taken that my dad had said, which he was a teacher for a number of years, was the fact that kids are supposed to misbehave. If you didn't have a kid pushing the boundaries, the kid would never learn anything, right? Like they push the boundaries to learn how to walk. They push the boundaries to learn how to talk. So they naturally have to push the boundaries to understand what's acceptable socially, what's acceptable in not just being a mindless robot and, looking to their parents for every single thing they have to do throughout the day, how they learn to, building blocks and all those different kind of things. And so you can't expect someone whose nature is to continue to push boundaries to grow to not occasionally overstep those boundaries, or go to a boundary that they shouldn't in those regards. And so again, to be automatically to the point where you're like, no, this deserves a spanking, this deserves yelling, isn't a very thoughtful way to help educate and grow that emotional intelligence in a child either.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that spanking works in the short term, and usually it does. But you also said that it doesn't work in the long term, because what you are creating in your relationship with your child when you yell, when you threaten and spank them, is a relationship based in fear, where the kid is scared of you. And so they tend to obey out of fear. And not only that, sometimes they tend to lie to you or hide things from you out of fear. And this relationship that you talked about, where kids push boundaries, if we can create a relationship with our children based on connection, then they get to test boundaries within a safe place where it's more like an experiment, and they get to grow into the best version of themselves. And we get to watch them and teach them, oh, I noticed that this morning, let's say for my own children, this morning you all were playing together so nicely, and look how happy you are. How does that feel? How does that feel to be connected, to have fun? Versus how does it feel when you guys are picking at each other? Now, there is this other aspect we haven't talked about this morning, is that, those bad habits, those stress habits. Some of us, we kind of like to be stressed out. It's not something we talk about a lot, but I mentioned this in the book, The Day I Threw Banana Bread, that when you yell like that, like really lose it, when you get rageful, you kind of get a high from it. You get this huge surge of adrenaline to your whole body. And not only that, but your family gets a surge of adrenaline. And after that moment, everyone has a huge release. So in that way, it's not just, it's a more deep habit in terms of our own body chemicals and our relationships with each other. Because what I've noticed is that, and I noticed when I was breaking the habit myself, is that when you decide, okay, I'm not going to yell at my kids anymore. And people experience this too in relationships with spouses, husbands and wives. Mm-hmm. When you stop, they'll pick at you. Sometimes they'll pick at you, try to push your buttons even harder than ever before. They're not doing it on purpose, but it's because they're craving that rush of adrenaline and that release as well. And we get those little rushes all the time, Troy, if you think about the news cycle. I actually started out as a news producer. That was my first career. In the news is an expert at knowing what our sort of addiction to stress is, because as soon as people stop clicking on news stories, the news stories change. Something else, the news media brings up something else for us to crave, that doom and gloom. The world's falling apart. But if you read, there's this great book called Factfulness by a statistician called, his name is Hans Rosling. He says, if you look at all of the statistics on the planet, including the ones that really indicate whether humanity is thriving or not, all of the statistics say we're thriving. We're getting better and better and better than ever before. So anyway, yeah, I know I covered a lot there, but I'm basically talking about this stress habit that we have, and it can be broken.
Yeah. No, and I think, right, like, no, I mean, it's, there are definitely endorphins and things that release emotion and stuff that way. But I also do think that when, again, if any type of change is hard, right? So when you are, whether it's the eating stuff, whether it's parenting, whether it's, controlling the emotions, those things are hard. And so the change is hard, it's hard to do and not fall back into the old habits. But as someone who doesn't really watch much news, because again, I know that anything that's really important will eventually make its way to me. I don't need to go out and try to find what's being sensationalized, but that living in non-stress, in my opinion, maybe, for someone who's living in stress, they're like, I could never live in non-stress. But I feel like for the most part, I don't have a lot of stress, or I'm able to let stuff, I understand that stuff's going to happen and we're just going to have to deal with it and adjust and things of that nature, that it really is a happier place to be in from a mental state of mind than dealing from a place of every day being stressful.
It is, though, I've found it's really hard to explain to someone who is panicked all the time, panicked about the kids, panicked about the news, panicked about their diet. It's hard to relay that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
One of the ways that I try to understand that with other people sometimes, right? So again, I'm very fortunate. My parents are married, have been married for almost 45 years. And that's awesome. And so when I meet someone, when I meet you, like, my default position is that your parents are married too. But I know in the back of my mind that, divorce rates are 50%. And so there's a coin flip as far as whether that really is the case or not. But again, because my experience is having my parents still be married, that's just kind of that default position that you naturally gravitate towards. And so whether that's, for meeting someone and their parents, or whether that's for how someone grew up and handled a stressful situation, whether that's how someone decide stuff. I'm not as decisive as I should be. I'm too analytical a lot of times, and so that's something that I'm working on. But again, it's what you've grown up with, and so again, it's on that undecisiveness. Like some people that can just make all these decisions really, really quickly. I'm like, but you're not thinking about what all these other things that could happen, right? And so, but I've learned that, well, there's no way to really know what else could happen in a lot of cases. And so, but that experience that you have just is so in your life is your life and you're living it, and it's just hard to get out of your own head in a lot of different situations.
Yeah, I was curious if you had any habits of your own that you made a transition and, if you could describe that transition. Some of my clients call it an earthquake.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, probably the biggest one is public speaking, right? And so like it's always a little funny to me, people who there's definitely people I've had as guests on the podcast here on Facebook Live who say they're nervous about doing that. When to me, even though I know that it's possible that 10 people might see this, I've even had a few where thousands of people have seen it. But for me, it's really just having a one-to-one conversation that some people are going to see. And so this isn't really public speaking, but as a high school kid, I dreaded public speaking, dreaded it. And now I definitely don't consider myself like an amazing public speaker or anything of that nature, but I understand that people who are really good at public speaking actually experience almost the exact same physiological feelings as someone who dreads public speaking. For them, it's a rush of adrenaline instead of a rush of fear, right? It's all these things that are really the exact same kind of feelings. And so I've been able to kind of turn that into being excited to give to public speak. I can't be quite as off the cuff or improv as some people who are naturally super talented public speakers. But if I know the topic I'm talking about, or if I prepared what I'm going to prepare, like getting up in front of a couple hundred people that way is nervous, but an exciting nervous. This is going to be kind of fun. I'm going to have, all these, endorphins going and stuff, instead of, oh my goodness, I've got to speak in front of 4 people. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things for me that I think I've hopefully grown in.
I love that because you talked about how you took this feeling and you channeled it in a different way. You took that sort of rush of fear and said, I'm going to say that's a rush of excitement. I'm going to try to experience that as a rush of excitement. And anyone who loses their temper can do the same thing. You can feel that sometimes it's sadness, anger that's creeping up in you. And you can choose with practice. It does take practice, and it does really take a teacher or a friend, somebody working with you, like a coach or a counselor or a group of people, or even your brother or sister, somebody to do this journey with you, your spouse. You can use that anger in a healthy way. You can use it to solve problems, to figure out your feelings and your values, to make those choices that are healthier for your own life and for the life of your family.
But you can use it again if you as someone who, if you would start to have those feelings, you can think of it as an opportunity, right? Like I now have this opportunity to give a life lesson to my son or daughter, to start, this is something that I found out they did versus they're a teenager, they do something stupid that I never find out about. This is something that I found out they did, and I can mold them as to why this was wrong and how they should handle it, the situation differently, instead of I'm just going to yell at them because they did something they weren't supposed to do.
Yeah, that's right. And not only that, but I love that you mentioned teenagers. Teenagers are really learning their own values too. And you can help them with that instead of just trying to shut them down all the time and punishing them and yelling at them or grounding them. You can talk about, sorry, my earbud fell out here. You can talk about their values. You know, a lot of teenagers will stay out late with friends and they sometimes get in trouble, quote unquote, get in trouble for that one way or another. A lot of parents will take screens and cell phones away, for example. But what if instead, when a child came home late from hanging out with friends, a parent, and it's funny, I've actually had almost this exact conversation with another mom. What if the parent said, "Sweetheart, I felt worried." So that's the feeling. The value is, I really care about you. You're my daughter. That's your value. And then what if the parent noticed the own child feelings and values? You love your friends. You love hanging out with them. You really value them. So I have values. I care about you. I care about your safety. And you have values. You care about your friends. Now let's work together to problem solve. It's such a beautiful way, beautiful, simple way to help a family live together with all of our various values, because you're going to have family values, right? Where everybody says, okay, yes, we all agree on kindness. We all value kindness. But there will be some values that weigh heavily, more heavily for others that are different. And one of the challenges as a family, or even the challenge in being a couple or having a friend, is how do we live together with our various values? And let me tell you, that's one of the keys for humanity too, is how can we live together globally on this planet with our, and be in harmony and peace with our various values.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had mentioned earlier some statistics about the pandemic. Kind of curious what you've seen at, with families and parents going into the pandemic. Obviously, I think a lot of the data shows that there was a rise in abusiveness and different things, as families that were dysfunctional to begin with now had to spend all their time together. But kind of curious, you get a little bit of your viewpoints on that, but then also how things have been transitioning as we're kind of coming out of that and able to spend more time doing a lot of the activities that we did pre-lockdown.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is heartbreaking. There has been more dysfunction for some people. More drinking, more yelling, more hitting, more unhealthy activities in some cases. But there's a gift in that. The gift is that some families have been hitting rock bottom. Some families have been saying, what is going on here? I don't want to live this way anymore. And so they do go to the search term, perhaps for the first time. I get notices about hits to my website about, and sometimes Google will tell me the search terms that led people to my website. And one that has been happening through the pandemic is, it's heartbreaking, but it's, I lost my temper and hit my child. And when they go and they search, like I said, a whole world opens up to them. Sometimes they buy my book, or they reach out to me, or they find somebody else, or they find all of these other parenting resources, these resources for families about how to handle stress and anger in healthy ways. So that's one of the gifts of the pandemic. And like any other habit, some people, now that we're kind of approaching normalcy, or hopefully headed
Sure.
into some sort of normalcy, they'll either slip back into the old habits, or this pandemic will have been a transformative experience. And of course, that is my prayer, Troy, That is my prayer for anyone under pressure, that that pressure will end up forming some sort of diamond in their life. They will find that silver lining in the cloud.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So you mentioned obviously you have your book, but you also have your website and your coaching, the tempercoaching.com. Do you do mostly, while you're based here in Austin, are most of your clients here locally as well too, or do you have, is obviously this seems like something you can generally do, remotely. Obviously we have to do everything remotely. You and I are both here in Austin and we're doing this remotely. But like what kind of balance or what kind of breakdown is that as far as like families that you work with that are here locally in Austin versus, Texas and the rest of the country?
It's probably 50-50. I work with people in person and I work with them online. Of course, in person is best. And that's true for any mentorship that you have in your life. I love to talk about mentorship. The more you can spend time with them, listening to them, talking with them, you're going to learn so much from them, not only from what they say, but how they talk and how they treat you. So, in person, for example, there's a family that I'm working with right now. When I'm with them and if they're having a tough moment, I can reach out to them and hold their hand or touch their hand. Or, I love to work with families. So if a child's there, I can talk with the child and the parent can see me do it and how I interact with them and how I connect with them. So yeah, I do both. Of course, you mentioned my book, my website. Anyone who wants to talk about this, have me teach a class, come and talk to their group. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me.
And so what are some of the best ways to do that? Obviously, probably the catch-all would be the website.
Yes.
You have email, have some other social stuff that way. But we got an email for you as well too, which is Jeanette at tempercoaching.com.
That's right.
And then obviously we're here primarily on Facebook, but also on YouTube. But you have your Facebook business page as well too, which is Temper Coaching.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the book's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It is worldwide, globally available.
And that is, there you go there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on today and chat a little bit about this. Right. I think for a lot of people and families, it's been an extra trying year. It's always, there's always stress and stuff going on for families. That's always going to happen. But this past year was definitely unique for most people experiences. So thanks for jumping on and taking the time to kind of chat and educate us a little bit.
Thank you for having me, Troy.
I appreciate it, everyone. Have a great day.